The 1850s was a time of turmoil in many parts of the world. There was the Second Opium War, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and the Taiping Rebellion. But most relevant to our story today was the Crimean War. To cut a very long story short, in 1853, war erupted between the Russian Empire and an alliance of several European powers, including the United Kingdom. At the same time, Australia was still very much a dominion of the British Empire, but was going through a lot of change. The Victorian gold rush had begun in 1851, beginning the boom years of the mid to late 19th century. This was also when Victoria became its own colony separate from New South Wales. Separation from New South Wales brought many advantages, but also a lot of responsibility for the small colony of just a few 100,000 people. This included its own defence, and so the Victorian colonial military was born. I will one day make a full video on this topic, because it's very interesting, but for now let's just say that the colony of Victoria had its own army and navy. In its early days it was little more than semi-organised collections of volunteers, assisted by some British forces still stationed here. Obviously, a key part of building the Victorian Navy was getting something to sail. Victoria lacked any kind of effective armed defence, and had no capacity to build its own ships. As a result, the various colonial governments sent urgent requests for help back to the UK, who responded by sending an 18-gun wooden sloop in August 1852 called HMS Electra. Now, during the Crimean War, there was a real belief in Australia that there would be a Russian attack. The fear of a seaborne invasion by the Russian Empire was one of the hot topics of the day, and many believed that it was a real possibility. So with this in mind, some preparations were made to defend ourselves. This included deploying small British forces to various points around Australia and raising the volunteer infantry that we talked about before, such as this one at Geelong in 1854. Despite all of this, there was a widespread view that Australia was vulnerable to even a small military force. The Electra was ridiculed in the press as being woefully inadequate, being a single, relatively small ship seemingly expected to fight off an entire squadron of the Russian Navy. In the midst of all this, at about 9 o'clock one evening on the 8th of September 1854, gunfire was suddenly heard across Melbourne coming from the sea in Port Phillip. The commotion of flares and rockets brought thousands of people out into the night, including to Flagstaff Hill, which commanded good views of the bay and was also the centre of maritime news and events. I've covered this in more detail in my video on Flagstaff Gardens, which you can see here in the top right hand corner. Now, people were a bit confused and not really sure what was going on, as the sounds of cannon boomed in the darkness. That was until a messenger on his horse suddenly made an appearance at Flagstaff Hill, having ridden as fast as he could from Sandridge, which is today Port Melbourne. He announced breathlessly to the gathered crowd that the Russians have come. And there were more alarming rumours that 2 Russian cruisers had been seen sailing around the bay, sinking every ship in sight. This shocking news spread like wildfire, and soon thousands of the good citizens of Melbourne rushed to fetch muskets, pitchforks, or any other weapons they could find. This makeshift mob rushed from all directions down to the beaches of Port Phillip, ready to fight and defend the colony from the Russian menace. The local military were put on alert, and even the Governor of Victoria, Charles Hotham, arrived at Sandridge from his house in Toorak, together with the Colonial Secretary Sir Robert Nicoll, who was seen riding his horse with all speed in the same direction. Others had gathered at Prince's Bridge, looking for a vantage point from which to view this great battle, while a crowd seeking news had gathered outside the office of the Argus newspaper in the city. Some women had gathered their presumably frightened children and assembled on Flagstaff Hill waiting for what they would have thought was the inevitable arrival of the invaders. But after all this, there were no Russians to be seen. Turns out all that had happened is that a ship called the SS Great Britain had recently arrived in Melbourne on the 18th of August, on one of its many trips carrying people to the Victorian goldfields. It had some cases of smallpox on board, and so was put into quarantine for a few weeks. When the all clear was given and it was released from the quarantine, the ship's captain decided to celebrate by firing off its guns, as you do, and other ships around it joined in by firing their guns too. This included the HMS Electra, which caused some to think that this was in anger, given that it was a warship. Now, I can only assume that the mob went back home rather sheepishly. In the following weeks, the papers were full of discussion of the incident. There was even a play put on just 10 days later about it. Called The Battle of Melbourne, it was an instant hit. I'd love to find any surviving copies if they're around, so if you know of any, please get in touch. The popular opinion in the newspapers condemned the captain of the Great Britain for firing the guns and creating the panic. But he had actually received permission from the harbour master to do this, so I'd argue that it wasn't entirely his fault. The hysteria and fear of an invasion at the time also almost certainly made this a much bigger incident than it otherwise might have been. While it might sound a tad ridiculous today, there was perhaps a small basis to these fears. The famous and disastrous sailing of Russia's Black Sea Fleet during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 showed that it did have the capacity to project its military power to this hemisphere. Even in the 1850s, Russia did maintain a sizable fleet off the coast of China, and given the patchy communication networks of the day, it would have been hard to give much advanced warning should it make a turn south. Now, if you're thinking that Melburnians were particularly jumpy, there were actually many similar Russian invasion scares around the world, both during the Crimean War and for decades afterwards, including in Sydney, Adelaide, and New Zealand. Other parts of the legacy of the Crimean War are still very visible right around Australia. Many captured guns were gifted to various colonial militaries, towns, and organisations around the country, many of which are still around as monuments and memorials. Other things like Fort Queenscliff, which was built at least partly in response to these fears, all serve as reminders of this period to this day, although nothing about this incident. Perhaps one day we'll get a monument to the Great Battle of Melbourne. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it and would like to see more, please subscribe to my channel so that you can stay up to date on future videos. Also check out my supporters portal at members.philipmallis.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.